Michael Carter had always been the kind of person who could make magic happen in a kitchen. At 28, he possessed an almost supernatural ability to transform flour, sugar, and butter into edible poetry that could make grown men weep with joy. His bakery in the French Quarter of New Orleans was legendary among locals and tourists alike, a small shop with hand-painted signs and windows that always seemed to glow with warm, golden light regardless of the time of day. But despite his professional success and the genuine love he felt for his craft, Michael had spent the better part of 2 years convinced that his real story, his most important story, was about someone else entirely. Her name was Janice, and she was everything Michael thought he wanted in a partner: beautiful, successful, confident in ways that made him feel both inspired and inadequate. She was a photographer who captured the essence of New Orleans in her work, someone who moved through the world with the kind of effortless grace that made Michael feel clumsy and oversized in comparison. Michael had met Janice at a gallery opening where she was exhibiting her latest collection of photographs documenting the city's recovery and renewal following various disasters. He had been there with a tray of his signature beignet, providing catering for the event, when she approached him with compliments about his pastries and questions about his techniques. The conversation had been easy and natural, and Michael had left that evening convinced he had met his soulmate. What followed was 18 months of what Michael later realized was essentially an elaborate performance on his part. He had molded himself into what he thought Janice wanted: more cultured, more artistic, more connected to the sophisticated circles she moved in. He learned about photography and art theory, attended gallery openings and cultural events that held little interest for him, and gradually abandoned many of the simple pleasures that had once brought him joy. Most significantly, Michael had become Janice's biggest supporter and promoter, using his social media presence to showcase her work, organizing events to highlight her photography, and generally positioning himself as her enthusiastic cheerleader rather than her equal partner. He told himself this was love, this willingness to subordinate his own identity to support someone else's dreams. But Janice, it turned out, had been seeing someone else the entire time. Not just seeing someone else, but in love with someone else. A man named James Holloway who was everything Michael was not. James was a successful actor, known for his intense dramatic roles and his ability to disappear completely into characters. He was tall where Michael was average height, reserved where Michael was gregarious, possessed of the kind of classical good looks that photographed beautifully next to Janice's own striking features. Michael discovered their relationship in the most modern and humiliating way possible through social media, where James had posted a series of intimate photographs of himself and Janice together, clearly taken over the course of many months. The images told a story of private moments and shared adventures, a relationship that had been developing in parallel to Michael's own imagined romance with Janice. The revelation hit Michael like a physical blow, not just because of the betrayal but because of what it revealed about his own behavior and choices. Looking back at his social media presence over the past 18 months, he could see how pathetic he had become, constantly posting about Janice's achievements, sharing her work, commenting on her posts with the kind of effusive praise that now seemed desperate and embarrassing. He had become what internet culture cruelly but accurately termed a simp, someone so desperate for romantic validation that he had abandoned his own identity and dignity in service of someone who had never actually reciprocated his feelings. The realization was devastating not just because of the romantic rejection, but because of what it said about how little he apparently valued himself. The morning after discovering Janice's relationship with James, Michael sat in his empty bakery before opening hours, surrounded by the familiar sense of yeast and vanilla, and made a series of decisions that would change the trajectory of his life. First, he methodically went through his social media accounts and deleted every post that mentioned Janice, every photograph that featured her, every comment that positioned him as her supporter rather than her equal. Then he blocked her on all platforms, not out of anger but out of recognition that he needed to create space between himself and the person he had become in relation to her. The process was humiliating but necessary, a digital cleansing that felt like removing a costume he had been wearing for so long he had forgotten it wasn't actually his skin. When he was finished, his social media presence looked strangely empty, but also somehow more honest. Just a baker who loved his craft, sharing images of beautiful food and the process of creating it. It was while he was in this state of emotional upheaval and identity crisis that Michael received an unexpected phone call from a television producer who had been following his work. The call came at noon on a Tuesday, just as Michael was pulling a batch of his famous praline bread pudding from the oven, and it would prove to be one of those moments when life pivots in an entirely unexpected direction. Michael Carter? The voice on the phone was crisp and professional, with the kind of energy that suggested important things happening quickly. This is Sandra Martinez from Reality Gold Productions. I hope you have a few minutes to talk about an opportunity that might interest you. Michael set down his oven mitts and gave his full attention to the call, curious about what kind of opportunity a television producer might have for a baker from New Orleans. We're casting for a new reality show called The Hourglass, Sandra continued. It's a survival-based competition set on a private island in the Caribbean, but with a twist. Instead of regular contestants, we're looking for people with unique skills and interesting personal stories. Artists, craftspeople, creators who can bring something special to the survival challenges. Michael found himself immediately intrigued despite his general skepticism about reality television. The timing seemed almost providential. He was in desperate need of a complete change of scenery and perspective, something that would force him out of the emotional rut he had been wallowing in since discovering Janice's betrayal. "What kind of challenges are we talking about?" he asked. "The usual survival elements: shelter building, food procurement, physical challenges, but also creative challenges that would let contestants use their specific skills. For someone with your culinary background, that might mean cooking challenges using only island resources or creating celebration meals for other contestants. The idea is to see how people's talents adapt to extreme circumstances." Sandra went on to explain that the show would film for 6 weeks on a private island off the coast of Honduras, with a cast of 12 contestants competing for a grand prize of $500,000. But more than the money, she emphasized, the show was designed to give people opportunities to showcase their talents to a global audience and potentially launch new careers or projects. "I have to be honest," Michael said, surprising himself with his directness. "I'm going through a pretty difficult time personally right now. I'm not sure I'm in the right headspace for something like this." "Actually," Sandra replied, "that might make you perfect for the show. Some of our best contestants have been people who were looking for a fresh start, a chance to rediscover who they are outside of their usual circumstances. The island has a way of stripping away all the noise and helping people focus on what really matters to them." The conversation continued for another 20 minutes, with Sandra explaining the logistics of filming, the types of challenges contestants might face, and the application process. By the time Michael hung up the phone, he found himself seriously considering the idea. 6 weeks away from New Orleans, away from the familiar routines and environments that reminded him of his recent humiliation, away from the temptation to check social media or fall back into old patterns of behavior. That evening, Michael called his sister Marie, the one person whose opinion he trusted completely when it came to major life decisions. Marie lived in Baton Rouge with her husband and 2 young children, and she had always been Michael's voice of reason during his various romantic and professional crises. "You want to do what now?" Marie's voice carried the kind of loving exasperation that only siblings could manage. "Michael, baby, you hate camping. You won't even go to the lake house without air conditioning." "This is different," Michael insisted, though he wasn't entirely sure how. "This is about challenging myself, about finding out who I am when I'm not trying to be what someone else wants me to be." "And you think you're going to figure that out by competing on a reality show with a bunch of strangers?" Michael paused, considering his sister's question seriously. Was he making this decision for the right reasons, or was he just running away from his problems in a particularly dramatic fashion? "I think," he said finally, "that I need to do something completely different from anything I've ever done before. I need to prove to myself that I'm capable of more than just making pastries and pining after women who don't want me." Marie was quiet for a long moment, and Michael could almost hear her processing his words and the pain behind them. "Okay," she said finally, "if you really think this will help you, then I support you. But promise me you won't do anything stupid just to get camera time. And promise me you'll remember that you're already enough, exactly as you are, regardless of what happens on this show." Michael felt tears prick at his eyes at his sister's words. Marie had always been able to see through his self-doubt and remind him of his worth, even when he couldn't see it himself. "I promise," he said. "And Marie, thank you for not trying to talk me out of it. Honey, if you need to go survive on a tropical island to remember how amazing you are, then that's what you need to do. Just don't come back with any weird reality show catchphrases. Okay?" 3 weeks later, Michael found himself on a small plane flying over the Caribbean, looking down at an island that would be his home for the next 6 weeks. The application and casting process had moved quickly once he committed to it, involving extensive interviews, psychological evaluations, and medical examinations. He had also been required to prepare for various types of challenges by learning basic survival skills and improving his physical fitness. But nothing had quite prepared him for the emotional impact of stepping onto the island and realizing that he was completely cut off from his familiar life and support systems. No social media, no phone calls home, no ability to retreat to his comfortable bakery when things became difficult. For the first time in years, Michael was forced to exist entirely in the present moment, without the distractions and coping mechanisms he had come to rely on. The island itself was breathtakingly beautiful. A small piece of tropical paradise with white sand beaches, crystal clear water, and lush jungle interior. The production team had constructed a basic camp with minimal shelter and supplies, leaving the contestants to figure out how to make themselves comfortable using their ingenuity and whatever resources they could find or create. Michael's first shock came when he realized that one of his fellow contestants was James Holloway, the very actor who had unknowingly been the cause of his recent emotional crisis. James was even more striking in person than in photographs, with the kind of presence that seemed to command attention without effort. But there was also something unexpectedly vulnerable about him, a quality of careful reserve that suggested someone who was used to protecting himself from unwanted scrutiny. The initial awkwardness of their situation was somewhat mitigated by the fact that James clearly had no idea who Michael was, or what connection he might have to Janice. To James, Michael was simply another contestant, someone to be assessed as either potential ally or competitor. This anonymity was both liberating and slightly insulting. Liberating because it meant Michael could start fresh without the baggage of his previous behavior, but insulting because it confirmed how little he had actually mattered in Janice's life. But the most surprising element of the cast was a contestant who wasn't human at all. Ray was an advanced AI robot who had been designed as a companion and assistant, but who had developed beyond his original programming in unexpected ways. His presence on the show was partly a publicity stunt and partly a genuine experiment in artificial intelligence and human interaction. Ray looked humanoid but clearly artificial, with smooth silver skin and glowing blue eyes that expressed remarkable emotional range despite their technological nature. What made him truly unique, however, was his passion for knitting and his philosophical approach to human relationships and emotions. Ray had somehow learned to knit during his development, and he created beautiful, intricate pieces that he decorated with quotes from great thinkers and activists. His favorite quotes seemed to come from Martin Luther King Jr., and Ray would often be found in quiet moments creating hats or scarves embroidered with phrases like, "Love is the force capable of transforming an enemy into a friend," or, "The arc of the moral universe is long, but it bends toward justice." When asked about his choice of quotes, Ray would explain in his measured, thoughtful way that Dr. King's words resonated with his understanding of human nature and the potential for growth and change. The combination of Ray's artificial intelligence and his deeply human insights into love and relationships made him an unexpected fan favorite among viewers, and his presence added a unique philosophical dimension to the show's typical survival drama. During the first week on the island, Michael focused primarily on establishing himself as a valuable team member and learning the basic skills necessary for survival. His culinary background proved unexpectedly useful, as he was able to identify edible plants and create meals from limited ingredients that kept morale high among the other contestants. But he also found himself paying careful attention to the group dynamics and individual personalities of his fellow castaways. James, he discovered, was far more complex than his public image suggested. While he was indeed reserved and sometimes appeared cold, Michael began to notice small acts of kindness and consideration that revealed a different character entirely. James would quietly help struggling contestants with challenges, share his limited supplies without being asked, and offer encouragement during difficult moments. He was also surprisingly knowledgeable about practical skills like shelter building and water purification, suggesting a background that went beyond his privileged acting career. Most intriguingly, Michael noticed that James seemed to be watching him with particular attention, though he couldn't determine whether this was strategic assessment or something more personal. There were moments during group discussions or challenges when Michael would catch James looking at him with an expression of curiosity or appreciation that made his heart race in ways he tried to ignore. Ray, meanwhile, had become something of a camp philosopher, offering insights into human behavior and relationships that were both profound and surprisingly comforting. He would often be found knitting while other contestants shared their personal stories around the evening campfire, his fingers working steadily while his glowing eyes reflected the flickering flames. Human relationships are fascinating, Ray observed one evening as the group discussed their motivations for joining the show. You all seem to be searching for something: validation, adventure, love, purpose. But what strikes me is how often you look for these things outside yourselves rather than recognizing what you already possess. Michael felt this observation hit uncomfortably close to home, remembering his months of seeking validation through Janice's approval rather than finding confidence in his own abilities and worth. "What about you, Ray?" asked another contestant. "What are you searching for?" Ray paused in his knitting, considering the question with the kind of careful attention he brought to all philosophical discussions. "I think I am searching for understanding," he said finally. "Understanding of what it means to care for others, to form connections that transcend utility or programming. Humans create bonds that serve no practical purpose but bring great joy and meaning. I find this both puzzling and beautiful." As the days passed and the group settled into routines, Michael found himself drawn into deeper conversations with both James and Ray. James, it turned out, had grown up in foster care, moving between homes and families that never quite provided the stability and love he needed. His success as an actor had given him financial security and professional recognition, but it had also reinforced his tendency to keep people at a distance and rely primarily on himself. "I learned early that most people leave eventually," James explained one evening as he and Michael worked together to gather firewood. "It's easier to expect it and prepare for it than to be surprised and hurt when it happens." Michael found himself wanting to comfort James, to challenge this pessimistic worldview, but he also recognized similar patterns in his own behavior. Hadn't he spent months trying to make himself indispensable to Janice, hoping that if he was useful enough, supportive enough, she would choose to keep him around? "Maybe," Michael said carefully, "the trick is learning to tell the difference between people who are just passing through and people who actually want to stay." James looked at him with surprise, as if this perspective hadn't occurred to him before. The conversation continued as they worked, touching on themes of trust, vulnerability, and the courage required to open your heart despite the risk of rejection. Ray, meanwhile, had become fascinated by Michael's baking skills and was eager to learn about the creative and emotional aspects of cooking. Despite his artificial nature, Ray seemed to understand intuitively that food was about more than nutrition. It was about comfort, celebration, memory, and love. "You put something of yourself into everything you create," Ray observed as he watched Michael prepare a simple meal using island ingredients. "I can see it in the way you taste and adjust, the way you consider how others will experience what you make. This is a form of love, is it not?" Michael paused, struck by Ray's insight. He had never thought of his baking in explicitly romantic terms, but Ray was right. There was something deeply personal and caring about the act of creating food for others to enjoy. "I guess it is," Michael said. "I've always felt like I could express things through baking that I couldn't say with words, like I could show people how much they meant to me by making something special just for them. And yet," Ray continued, "you seem surprised when people appreciate this gift. You act as though your care and skill are ordinary things, not worthy of recognition or gratitude." This observation hit Michael like a gentle but powerful revelation. Ray was right. He had spent so much time focusing on what he lacked, what he couldn't offer, that he had minimized the genuine value of what he could provide. His baking wasn't just a job or a hobby. It was a form of love that brought joy and comfort to others. Why had he been so willing to diminish this gift in his own mind? As the second week progressed, the challenges became more complex and the group dynamics more intense. Several contestants had formed alliances, others had emerged as leaders or followers, and the pressure of competition was beginning to reveal both the best and worst aspects of everyone's personality. Michael found himself in an interesting position. His cooking skills made him valuable to everyone, but his generally agreeable nature meant he wasn't seen as a major competitive threat. This allowed him to observe the social dynamics without being at the center of major conflicts, and what he observed was often illuminating. James, he noticed, had a tendency to withdraw when things became emotionally intense, but he also had moments of unexpected tenderness and protectiveness. During one particularly difficult challenge that required contestants to work in pairs, James had been paired with an older contestant who was struggling with the physical demands. Rather than becoming frustrated or trying to carry the entire burden himself, James had patiently helped his partner, offering encouragement and practical support that allowed them to succeed together. Michael found himself deeply moved by this display of quiet compassion, and he began to wonder if there might be more to James than the reserved, somewhat cold exterior he typically presented. The turning point in their relationship came during the third week, when a severe storm hit the island and the contestants were forced to take shelter together in the limited protected spaces available. The production team had provided emergency shelter and supplies, but the experience of being confined together during the storm created an enforced intimacy that broke down many of the social barriers that had been maintaining. Michael found himself sharing a small shelter with James and Ray, and the hours of waiting out the storm led to some of the most honest conversations he had experienced in years. Perhaps it was the enforced proximity, or the reminder of their human fragility in the face of natural forces, but all three of them seemed to drop their usual defenses and speak more openly about their fears, hopes, and experiences. James talked about his childhood in foster care, about the loneliness of growing up without stable attachments, and about how his acting career had both saved him and isolated him further. He spoke about the difficulty of forming genuine relationships when people were often more interested in his fame and success than in who he actually was beneath the public persona. Michael, in turn, found himself sharing his recent experience with Janice, his humiliation at discovering her relationship with someone else, and his realization that he had lost himself in trying to become what he thought she wanted. He talked about his decision to join the show as a way of rediscovering who he was outside of his romantic relationships and professional identity. Ray listened to both of them with his characteristic thoughtful attention, occasionally offering insights or questions that helped them process their experiences more deeply. "It seems to me," Ray said at one point, "that you both struggle with the same fundamental question: how to be vulnerable enough to form genuine connections while still protecting yourselves from being hurt or rejected." Michael and James looked at each other, recognizing the truth in Ray's observation and the commonality of their emotional challenges despite their very different backgrounds and personalities. "The thing about vulnerability," Ray continued, his fingers working steadily on a new knitting project, "is that it cannot be controlled or guaranteed. You cannot make someone love you by being vulnerable, but you also cannot be truly loved without being vulnerable. The risk is inherent in the process." As the storm raged outside their small shelter, Michael found himself studying James's face in the dim light, noticing details he had never observed before. The way James's eyes crinkled slightly when he was thinking deeply, the unconscious way he ran his fingers through his hair when he was nervous or uncertain, the genuine warmth that appeared in his expression when he was talking about something that mattered to him. And somewhere in that small, storm-battered shelter, with Ray's knitting needles clicking softly in the background, Michael realized that his feelings were shifting in ways he hadn't anticipated. The attraction he felt toward James wasn't just physical or romantic curiosity. It was a deeper recognition of compatibility, of shared values and complementary strengths. But Michael also recognized the irony of his situation. He had come to the island to escape the complications of unrequited love, only to find himself potentially developing feelings for someone else who might not return them. The parallel to his situation with Janice was uncomfortable and somewhat mortifying. After the storm passed and normal camp routines resumed, Michael made a conscious decision to be more cautious about his emotional investment in James. He continued to be friendly and collaborative, but he tried to maintain more distance and avoid the kind of intense personal conversations that had characterized their time in the shelter. This strategy might have worked if James had been content to return to their previous, more superficial interactions. But instead, James seemed to be seeking out more opportunities to spend time with Michael, to continue the conversations they had started during the storm. Michael noticed that James would often position himself nearby during group activities, would volunteer to partner with Michael during challenges, and would linger after group conversations to continue discussing topics they had touched on. Most significantly, James had begun doing small things that seemed designed to take care of Michael in ways that went beyond basic alliance strategy. When Michael had trouble sleeping due to anxiety about an upcoming challenge, he woke to find an extra blanket had been placed over him during the night. When he struggled with a particularly difficult physical challenge, James appeared at his side offering encouragement and practical assistance. When Michael was feeling homesick and missing his sister, James sat with him and listened as he shared stories about his family, offering comfort without trying to solve the problem or minimize his feelings. Most touchingly, James had approached Ray about learning to knit, and together they had created a simple but beautiful hat embroidered with the letter M in elegant script. When James presented it to Michael, he did so with obvious nervousness, as if he was afraid the gesture might be rejected or misunderstood. "I know it's not as elaborate as Ray's philosophical pieces," James said, holding out the hat with careful hands. "But I thought you might like having something made specifically for you." Michael accepted the hat with hands that weren't entirely steady, touched by the thoughtfulness of the gesture and the obvious time and effort that had gone into creating it. The hat fit perfectly and was surprisingly well made for someone who was clearly new to knitting. "This is beautiful," Michael said, and meant it completely. "Thank you for thinking of me." The exchange was witnessed by several other contestants, and Michael noticed knowing looks and whispered conversations that suggested their developing connection had not gone unnoticed by the group. But rather than feeling embarrassed or defensive, Michael found himself oddly pleased that others could see the care and attention James was showing him. Ray, meanwhile, had been observing their interaction with his characteristic thoughtful attention, and he approached Michael later that evening as Michael was wearing his new hat and preparing for sleep. "You seem happier," Ray observed, settling down nearby with his latest knitting project, a scarf that appeared to be decorated with quotes about courage and authenticity. "Do I?" Michael asked, though he suspected Ray was right. Despite the challenges and discomforts of island life, despite the ongoing competition and social pressures, Michael found himself feeling more content and hopeful than he had in months. "You do. And James seems different as well. Less guarded, more present in his interactions with others." Ray paused in his knitting to look directly at Michael. "I believe you are both discovering something important about yourselves and about each other." "Ray," Michael said carefully, "do you think it's possible for people to change who they're attracted to? To discover aspects of themselves they didn't know existed?" Ray considered this question with his usual thoughtfulness, his glowing eyes reflecting the dying embers of their campfire. "I think," Ray said finally, "that humans are much more complex and adaptable than they often believe themselves to be. You may be discovering not that you have changed, but that you never fully understood yourself to begin with. The heart, as I understand it, does not always follow the patterns that the mind expects." That night, Michael lay awake thinking about Ray's words and about the growing connection he felt with James. Was it possible that his attraction to Janice had been more about the idea of being in love than about Janice herself? Had he been so focused on fitting into a conventional romantic narrative that he had ignored other possibilities for connection and happiness? The next morning brought a challenge that would test not just their physical abilities but their emotional resilience as well. The contestants were required to work in pairs to navigate a complex obstacle course that required trust, communication, and mutual support. Michael found himself paired with James, and as they worked together to overcome each obstacle, he was struck by how naturally they complemented each other's strengths and compensated for each other's weaknesses. James's height and reach helped them overcome physical barriers that Michael couldn't have managed alone, while Michael's creativity and problem-solving skills helped them find solutions to puzzles that had stumped other teams. More importantly, they communicated with an ease and understanding that surprised both of them, anticipating each other's needs and offering support without having to ask for it. When they successfully completed the course, finishing among the top teams, Michael found himself swept up in James's enthusiastic celebration. For a moment, all of James's usual reserve disappeared, and he lifted Michael off the ground in a spontaneous hug that left both of them breathless and staring at each other with new awareness. The moment was broken by the arrival of other contestants and the need to return to normal social interactions. But something had shifted between them. Some barrier had been crossed that couldn't be uncrossed. That evening, as the group gathered around their campfire for their usual evening discussions, Michael noticed that James kept glancing at him with an expression he couldn't quite read. Ray, meanwhile, had positioned himself where he could observe both of them while working on his latest creation, a blanket that appeared to be decorated with quotes about love and courage. The conversation that night turned to relationships and the different forms that love could take. Several contestants shared stories about their romantic experiences, their hopes for the future, and their beliefs about compatibility and attraction. Michael found himself listening with new ears, hearing themes and perspectives that resonated with his recent experiences and evolving understanding of himself. When the discussion turned to him, Michael found himself speaking more honestly than he had intended. "I used to think I knew exactly what I wanted in a partner," he said, staring into the fire rather than meeting anyone's eyes directly. "I had this very specific idea of what love should look like, what kind of person I should be attracted to, what kind of relationship would make me happy." He paused, gathering courage for what he wanted to say next. "But being here, getting to know all of you, has made me realize that maybe I was limiting myself. Maybe I was so focused on one particular vision of love that I was missing other possibilities that might actually make me happier." Several contestants nodded in understanding, and Michael noticed that James was watching him with particularly close attention. "Love is not always what we expect it to be," Ray observed, his knitting needles clicking softly in the firelight. "Sometimes the most profound connections form in ways that surprise us, with people who challenge our assumptions about ourselves and about what we need to be happy." After the group discussion ended and most contestants had retreated to their shelters, Michael found himself alone with James and Ray beside the dying fire. The three of them sat in comfortable silence for a while, each lost in their own thoughts about the evening's conversation and its implications. Finally, James spoke, his voice quiet but clear in the tropical night air. "Michael," he said, "there's something I want to tell you. Something I've been thinking about for weeks but wasn't sure how to say." Michael's heart began to race, though he tried to keep his expression neutral and receptive. "When I first met you, when we first arrived on this island, I thought I knew what to expect from this experience. I thought it would be about survival skills and competitive strategy, about pushing myself physically and mentally." James paused, seeming to gather courage for what he wanted to say next. "I didn't expect to meet someone who would make me question everything I thought I knew about myself and about what I want in my life. I didn't expect to find myself caring about someone in ways I've never experienced before." The words hung in the air between them, loaded with possibility and vulnerability. Michael felt his breath catch as he processed what James might be saying, what he might be offering. "James," Michael said softly, "are you saying what I think you're saying? I'm saying that you've been the most important part of this experience for me. Not the challenges or the competition or the potential prize money. You. Getting to know you, learning to trust you, discovering how you see the world and how you make everything around you better just by being yourself." Ray had stopped knitting and was watching both of them with an expression of gentle satisfaction, as if he had been waiting for this moment and was pleased to see it finally arriving. "I'm saying," James continued, "that I think I've been falling in love with you, and it's both the most terrifying and the most wonderful thing that's ever happened to me." The confession hung in the air like a bridge waiting to be crossed, and Michael found himself standing at a crossroads that would determine the direction of his entire future. He could deflect, make excuses, retreat into the safety of denial and familiar patterns, or he could step forward into uncertainty and possibility, into the kind of love that Ray had described, unexpected, challenging, transformative. "James," Michael said, his voice stronger and more certain than he had expected, "I've been falling in love with you too, And you're right. It's terrifying and wonderful and nothing like what I thought love was supposed to feel like. When James reached for his hand, Michael didn't hesitate to take it, marveling at how right the connection felt, how natural and inevitable. Well, Ray said with obvious satisfaction, setting aside his knitting to look at both of them, I believe this calls for a celebration, and perhaps a new knitting project with an appropriate quote about love and courage and the beauty of unexpected connections. The remaining weeks on the island passed in a blur of challenges, competitions, and deepening intimacy between Michael and James. Their relationship became the worst-kept secret among the contestants, though everyone seemed genuinely happy for them rather than viewing their connection as a strategic threat. Ray appointed himself their unofficial relationship counselor and cheerleader, creating an entire collection of knitted items decorated with quotes about love, partnership, and the courage to be vulnerable. His favorites seemed to be variations on themes of authenticity and acceptance. To be yourself in a world that is constantly trying to make you something else is the greatest accomplishment, and the privilege of a lifetime is being who you are. Michael found that his feelings for James deepened and intensified in ways that felt completely different from his previous romantic experiences. Where his attraction to Janice had been based largely on admiration and the desire for validation, his love for James felt grounded in genuine compatibility and mutual understanding. They balanced each other in ways that felt natural and sustainable, each bringing strengths that complemented the other's weaknesses. James, meanwhile, seemed to bloom under the influence of their relationship, becoming more open and expressive not just with Michael but with the entire group. His natural reserve remained, but it was no longer a wall designed to keep people out. Instead, it became a form of thoughtful consideration that made his gestures of affection and care all the more meaningful. The show's challenges continued to test their individual skills and their ability to work together under pressure, but Michael and James found that their partnership made them both stronger competitors. They were able to support each other through difficulties, celebrate each other's successes, and provide the kind of emotional stability that allowed them both to perform at their best. But perhaps the most significant development was the way their relationship affected their understanding of themselves and their future goals. Michael realized that his dream of owning a bakery didn't have to be a solitary pursuit. He could envision sharing that dream with someone else, creating something together that would be stronger and more meaningful than what either of them could build alone. James, for his part, began to talk about wanting to use his success and platform to create projects that were more personally meaningful, work that would allow him to express the depth and authenticity that his relationship with Michael had helped him discover in himself. As the final week of competition approached, both Michael and James found themselves caring less about the show's outcome and more about what would happen to their relationship once they returned to the real world. They had found something precious and rare on the island, but they both understood that maintaining their connection would require careful attention and deliberate choices once they were back in their regular lives. The final challenges were designed to test not just individual skills but the relationships and alliances that had formed over the course of the show. Michael and James found themselves working together seamlessly, their partnership having evolved to the point where they could communicate almost without words, anticipating each other's needs and providing support that felt automatic and natural. When the show's winner was finally announced, an outcome that felt almost anticlimactic compared to the personal growth and connections that had developed, Michael realized that he had achieved something far more valuable than prize money or television exposure. He had discovered parts of himself that he had never known existed, and he had found a love that felt authentic and sustainable in ways he had never experienced before. The final evening on the island was bittersweet, as contestants prepared to return to their regular lives, and the relationships they had formed faced the test of real-world pressures and distances. But Michael and James spent the evening making concrete plans for their future together, discussing how they could coordinate their career goals and life plans to build something lasting. Ray, meanwhile, presented them with his final gift, a beautiful blanket that he had been working on throughout the final weeks of the show. The blanket was decorated with a quote that he said had been inspired by watching their relationship develop. Love is not about finding someone to complete you, but about finding someone who encourages you to complete yourself. When the helicopter arrived to take them back to the mainland, Michael found himself looking back at the island with gratitude rather than relief. The experience had been challenging and sometimes difficult, but it had also been transformative in ways he was still processing. 6 months later, Michael and James were preparing to open their joint venture in New Orleans, a combination bakery and artisan shop called Love and Loops, where Michael created his signature pastries and James had learned to craft beautiful handmade items inspired by Ray's knitting techniques. Ray himself had become a regular collaborator, spending time at the shop and contributing his philosophical insights to a YouTube series they had started documenting their life together and their creative projects. The YouTube series had become unexpectedly popular, attracting viewers who were drawn to the combination of practical creative instruction, relationship advice, and Ray's unique perspective on human nature and personal growth. Episodes typically featured Michael baking while James worked on various craft projects, with Ray offering commentary and creating his signature pieces decorated with inspirational quotes. The series allowed them to share their story with a broader audience while also providing a platform for discussing topics that mattered to them: the nature of love and partnership, the importance of authenticity and vulnerability, the value of creative expression as a form of emotional communication. But perhaps the most meaningful aspect of their new life together was how naturally and seamlessly their partnership had evolved. They had learned to support each other's individual growth while building something together that reflected their shared values and complementary strengths. Michael's baking had reached new levels of creativity and emotional resonance, inspired by his deeper understanding of love and connection. James had discovered a talent for creating beautiful, meaningful objects with his hands, work that satisfied him in ways that acting had never quite achieved. And Ray continued to evolve and grow, his understanding of human relationships deepening through his observation of their partnership and his interactions with the shop's customers and YouTube audience. The final video in their first season of Love and Loops featured all three of them working together to create a special celebration cake for the shop's grand opening. As they worked, they reflected on the journey that had brought them together and the unexpected ways that life had exceeded their individual expectations and dreams. "I used to think," Michael said as he put finishing touches on an elaborate sugar flower, "that love was about finding someone who would complete some missing piece of myself. But I've learned that real love is about finding someone who inspires you to become more fully yourself than you ever thought possible." James, who was creating a decorative wooden stand for the cake, nodded in agreement. "I spent so many years protecting myself from being hurt that I almost missed out on the most important relationship of my life. Sometimes the biggest risk is not taking any risks at all." Ray, meanwhile, was adding final touches to a banner he had knitted for the occasion, decorated with one of his favorite quotes from their time together. "The main character isn't always the person featured on the cover. Sometimes it's the person who stayed beside you when everyone else walked away." As they prepared for the shop's opening celebration, surrounded by friends and family who had come to support their new venture, Michael reflected on how dramatically his life had changed since that difficult morning when he had discovered Janice's relationship with someone else. The pain and humiliation that had seemed so devastating at the time had actually been the beginning of a journey that led him to discover his authentic self and find a love that was deeper and more meaningful than anything he had previously imagined. He looked around at the beautiful space they had created together, at James arranging flowers with the same careful attention he brought to everything he cared about, at Ray organizing his collection of philosophical knitted pieces, at the friends and family members who had gathered to celebrate their success. This was the life he had been meant to live, the story he had been meant to tell, the love he had been meant to find. And as the celebration began and their shop filled with laughter and conversation, Michael understood that sometimes the most beautiful stories are the ones that begin with endings, with moments when everything you thought you knew about yourself turns out to be just the first chapter of a much larger and more wonderful tale. The banner Ray had created fluttered gently in the New Orleans breeze, its message visible to everyone who passed by. Love is not about being the main character in someone else's story. It's about finding someone who wants to write a new story with you, one beautiful stitch at a time. The success of Love and Loops exceeded all of their expectations, becoming not just a popular local destination but a symbol of creativity, authenticity, and the power of unexpected partnerships. Within the first year, they had expanded from a simple bakery and craft shop into a full cultural experience that attracted visitors from around the world who came not just for Michael's extraordinary pastries, but for the unique atmosphere of collaboration and philosophical reflection that Ray's presence brought to everything they did. The YouTube series had grown into something much larger than any of them had anticipated, spawning merchandise, cookbook deals, and speaking engagements. But more importantly, it had created a community of viewers who found genuine inspiration in watching three very different beings work together to create beauty and meaning in their daily lives. The comments section of their videos had become a place where people shared their own stories of unexpected love, creative collaboration, and personal transformation. Ray had become something of an internet celebrity in his own right, with his philosophical knitting tutorials generating millions of views and his inspirational quotes being shared across social media platforms. He had developed a particular following among people going through difficult life transitions, those who found comfort in his unique perspective on human resilience and the potential for growth and change. The beautiful thing about Ray's popularity, James observed one evening as they reviewed their latest video analytics, is that he's proving that wisdom and compassion can come from the most unexpected sources. People are learning to look beyond surface appearances and preconceptions to find meaning and connection. Michael nodded, stirring a pot of praline sauce while watching Ray work on his latest creation, a series of small blankets for a local children's hospital, each one decorated with quotes about courage and hope. Ray had developed an entire charitable initiative around his knitting, creating items for various organizations while teaching workshops on both craft techniques and emotional resilience. "I love how he's used his platform to help others," Michael said. "It's like he's taken everything he learned about human nature from observing us and turned it into a way of serving the broader community." The success of their various projects had also allowed Michael and James to deepen their individual artistic practices in ways that complemented their partnership. Michael had begun experimenting with more elaborate and conceptual baking projects, creating edible art pieces that told stories about love, identity, and transformation. His work had been featured in several food and art magazines, and he had been invited to participate in culinary festivals and exhibitions around the country. James, meanwhile, had discovered a genuine passion for woodworking and textile arts, skills that had evolved far beyond his initial attempts at knitting with Ray. He had developed a particular talent for creating functional art pieces, furniture and household items that were both beautiful and meaningful. His work had been featured in several design publications, and he had begun accepting custom commissions for clients who wanted pieces that reflected their personal stories and values. But perhaps the most significant development in their lives was how their relationship had continued to evolve and deepen as they navigated the challenges and opportunities of their shared success. They had learned to support each other's individual growth while maintaining the strong partnership that had brought them together, and their love had matured into something that felt both stable and dynamic. The second season of their YouTube series had focused more explicitly on relationship dynamics and the practical aspects of building a life together. Episodes covered topics like conflict resolution, financial planning, balancing individual and shared goals, and maintaining intimacy while working together professionally. The response from viewers had been overwhelmingly positive, with many couples commenting that the series had helped them navigate their own relationship challenges. "We never intended to become relationship counselors," Michael said during one of their evening conversations, "but I think there's something valuable about showing people what a healthy partnership actually looks like in practice, not just in theory." James agreed, noting that their willingness to be vulnerable about their own struggles and growth had seemed to give viewers permission to be more honest about their own relationships and challenges. "I think people are hungry for authentic examples of love and partnership," he said. "So much of what we see in media is either idealized romance or dramatic dysfunction. There's not enough representation of real, sustainable love that involves work and growth and daily choices to care for each other." Ray had been particularly interested in this aspect of their impact, conducting his own informal research into the ways their content was affecting viewers' relationships and life choices. He had developed a series of knitting patterns specifically designed for couples to work on together, projects that required communication, patience, and mutual support to complete successfully. "Creating something together requires many of the same skills as building a relationship," Ray explained during one of their videos. "You must communicate clearly, be patient with mistakes, support each other through difficult sections, and maintain vision for the final result even when progress seems slow." The patterns had become incredibly popular, with couples around the world sharing photos of their completed projects and stories about what they had learned about themselves and their relationships through the process. As their second year in business approached, Michael and James began discussing the possibility of expanding their impact beyond their current projects. They had been approached by several publishers about writing books, by television producers about developing their own show, and by various organizations about creating educational programs or workshops. The most intriguing opportunity had come from an unexpected source, a consortium of universities and research institutions that were interested in studying the unique dynamic between humans and AI that Ray represented. They wanted to create a formal research program that would explore questions about artificial intelligence, consciousness, creativity, and the potential for meaningful relationships between humans and synthetic beings. "It would be fascinating," James said as they discussed the proposal over dinner. "Ray has developed so far beyond his original programming, and his insights into human nature and relationships are genuinely profound. Studying how he's evolved could help us understand both artificial intelligence and human consciousness in new ways." Ray himself was intrigued by the possibility, though he approached it with his characteristic thoughtfulness and concern for others. "I would be interested in participating," he said, "but only if the research would genuinely benefit others and not just satisfy academic curiosity. If my experiences could help create better AI companions for people who are lonely or isolated, or if they could help humans better understand their own capacity for growth and connection, then I believe it would be worthwhile." Michael found himself particularly drawn to this opportunity because it represented a chance to contribute to something larger than their individual success, something that could have lasting impact on how society understood love, relationships, and the potential for connection across different forms of consciousness. "Ray has taught us so much about what it means to care for others," Michael said. "If sharing his story and his insights could help other people learn those same lessons, I think we should seriously consider it." The research program would involve spending several months each year at various universities, participating in studies and workshops while continuing their regular work at Love and Loops. It would also involve documenting Ray's continued development and evolution, creating a comprehensive record of how an artificial intelligence could develop emotional complexity and meaningful relationships. But beyond the academic aspects, the program appealed to all three of them because it represented a natural extension of the work they were already doing, helping people understand the nature of love and connection, and demonstrating that meaningful relationships could form in unexpected ways between unlikely partners. As they discussed the various opportunities and possibilities, Michael found himself reflecting on how dramatically his life had changed since that morning when he had discovered Janice's relationship with James. The pain and humiliation that had felt so devastating at the time had actually been the catalyst for a journey that had led him to discover his authentic self and find forms of love and partnership that exceeded anything he had previously imagined. "Sometimes I wonder what would have happened if I hadn't found out about Janice and James," he said during one of their evening conversations. "If I had just continued in that pattern of unrequited love and self-diminishment, where would I be now?" James considered this question seriously, as he did most philosophical discussions. "I think you would have found your way to authenticity eventually," he said. "You're too intelligent and self-aware to have stayed in that pattern forever. But maybe it would have taken longer, and maybe you would have missed out on some of the opportunities that came from being forced to confront the situation directly." Ray, who had been listening while working on a new project, offered his own perspective. "I believe that humans often require some form of catalyst to move beyond their comfortable patterns and embrace growth," he said. "Pain can serve this function, but so can joy, curiosity, or simply the recognition that there are other possibilities available." Michael's experience with rejection was difficult, but it also created space for him to discover aspects of himself and forms of love that he might never have explored otherwise. These conversations about alternate possibilities and life paths had become a regular part of their evening routines, philosophical discussions that helped them process their experiences and maintain perspective on their current success and happiness. The third season of their YouTube series incorporated more of these philosophical elements, with episodes that explored questions about fate, choice, personal growth, and the role of difficult experiences in leading people toward their authentic paths. Ray's contributions to these discussions had become increasingly sophisticated, and his insights were often quoted and shared far beyond their immediate audience. One particularly popular episode had focused on the concept of productive failure, the idea that some of life's most important breakthroughs came not from success, but from experiences that initially felt like failures or rejections. Michael had shared his story about Janice in detail, explaining how that painful experience had ultimately led him to discover his true sexual identity and find a relationship that was more authentic and fulfilling than anything he had previously imagined. "I used to think that being rejected by Janice was one of the worst things that had ever happened to me," Michael said in the episode. "But now I understand that it was actually one of the best things, because it forced me to stop pretending to be someone I wasn't and start exploring who I actually am." The episode had generated thousands of comments from viewers sharing their own stories of how apparent failures or rejections had led to unexpected opportunities and discoveries. Many people had written about coming to terms with their own sexual identity, leaving unsatisfying relationships, or making major life changes after experiencing what initially felt like devastating setbacks. Ray had created a special knitting pattern to accompany the episode, a design that incorporated both smooth, easy sections and challenging, complex areas that required patience and skill to complete. The pattern came with instructions that explicitly connected the knitting process to personal growth and resilience. Like life, Ray had written in the pattern instructions, "This project will require you to navigate both simple and difficult sections. The challenging parts may be frustrating, but they are also where the most learning and growth occur. Trust the process, be patient with yourself, and remember that the final result will be more beautiful because of the complexity involved in creating it." The pattern had become one of their most popular offerings, with knitters around the world sharing photos of their completed projects and stories about what they had learned about themselves through the process. As their business continued to grow and evolve, Michael and James found themselves facing new challenges related to managing success while maintaining their core values and relationship dynamics. They had to learn how to handle increased public attention, coordinate their various projects and commitments, and ensure that their partnership remained strong despite the pressures and demands of their expanding careers. Ray had proved invaluable in helping them navigate these challenges, offering insights based on his observations of human behavior and his understanding of relationship dynamics. He had developed a particular expertise in helping people maintain authenticity and connection in the face of external pressures and expectations. "Success can be as challenging as failure," Ray observed during one of their planning sessions. "It requires different skills and creates different pressures, but it still demands growth and adaptation. The key is remembering why you began this journey and ensuring that your choices continue to reflect your core values and commitment to each other." This wisdom had helped them make decisions about which opportunities to pursue and which to decline, always prioritizing their relationship and personal well-being over external measures of success or achievement. One of the most significant challenges they faced was managing the increased attention to their personal relationship, as their romantic partnership had become almost as famous as their professional collaborations. While they were comfortable sharing certain aspects of their relationship through their content, they also recognized the importance of maintaining some privacy and boundaries. "We want to be helpful to people who are navigating similar relationship challenges," James said during a discussion about their content strategy, "but we also need to protect the intimacy and privacy that make our relationship work. Finding that balance is an ongoing process." They had developed guidelines about what aspects of their relationship they were comfortable sharing publicly and what they preferred to keep private, boundaries that they revisited regularly as their circumstances and comfort levels evolved. Ray had been particularly helpful in this area, offering perspectives on privacy, authenticity, and the ethics of sharing personal information for public benefit. His insights had helped them develop approaches that felt both generous and sustainable. The fourth season of their YouTube series had explored these themes explicitly, with episodes about maintaining authentic relationships in public settings, setting healthy boundaries, and the difference between vulnerability and oversharing. The content had resonated strongly with viewers who were dealing with their own challenges related to social media, public attention, and the pressure to perform their relationships for others. As they entered their third year of business, Michael and James began discussing more long-term plans for their life together, including the possibility of expanding their family. They had talked about adoption, fostering, or other ways of creating a larger household that could provide stability and love for children who needed it. "I think we have a lot to offer as parents," Michael said during one of their evening conversations. We've learned so much about communication, patience, and supporting each other through challenges. And Ray would be an incredible influence on any children in our household. James agreed, noting that his own experience in foster care had given him particular insight into what children needed to feel secure and valued. I know what it feels like to grow up without consistent love and support, he said. I'd love to be able to provide that stability and care for children who need it, to give them the kind of foundation I didn't have. Ray had been fascinated by their discussions about family and parenting, approaching the topic with his characteristic combination of intellectual curiosity and emotional wisdom. Children seem to possess a natural capacity for wonder and growth that adults sometimes lose, Ray observed. Being around children might teach all of us new things about creativity, curiosity, and unconditional love. I believe I would learn as much from them as I could teach them. The possibility of expanding their family added new dimensions to their long-term planning, as they considered what changes they might need to make to their living situation, work schedules, and life priorities. But rather than feeling overwhelming, these discussions felt exciting and natural, like the logical next step in their ongoing journey together. As they celebrated the 3rd anniversary of their first meeting on the island, Michael found himself marveling at the unexpected trajectory their lives had taken. What had begun as a desperate attempt to escape the pain of unrequited love had evolved into a life that exceeded his wildest dreams in terms of both personal fulfillment and professional success. But more than the external achievements, Michael was most grateful for the personal growth and authentic love that had emerged from those challenging early experiences. He had learned to trust his own instincts, to value his unique gifts and perspectives, and to build relationships based on mutual respect and genuine compatibility rather than desperation or the need for validation. I sometimes wonder what advice I would give to my younger self, Michael said as they sat together on their porch, watching the sun set over New Orleans while Ray worked on his latest creation nearby. What I would tell the person who was so desperate for Janice's attention that he lost sight of his own worth and identity. James considered this question while absently running his fingers through Michael's hair, a gesture that had become automatic and comforting for both of them. What would you tell him? James asked. I think I would tell him that the love he was looking for was real and possible, but that he was looking for it in the wrong place and in the wrong way, Michael said. I would tell him that he didn't need to diminish himself to be worthy of love, and that the right person would appreciate him for exactly who he was, not for who he could become in service of their needs. Ray looked up from his knitting, having overheard the conversation. That is wise counsel, Ray said. But I wonder if your younger self would have been able to hear and accept such advice, or if he needed to go through the experience of loss and discovery to truly understand these truths. Michael considered Ray's point, recognizing the wisdom in it. Sometimes the most important lessons could only be learned through direct experience, no matter how much others tried to share their insights and warnings. You're probably right, Michael admitted. I think I needed to go through that process of losing myself and then finding myself again to truly appreciate the love and partnership I have now. The contrast made me more grateful and more aware of what real love actually feels like. As the evening settled around them and the familiar sounds of their neighborhood filled the air, Michael reflected on the strange and wonderful journey that had brought him to this moment. He had a successful business, a loving partnership, a unique friend in Ray, and work that felt meaningful and fulfilling. But more than any of these external achievements, he had found a sense of peace and authenticity that made each day feel like a gift. The future stretched before them full of possibilities, new projects to explore, children to potentially welcome into their family, communities to serve through their various initiatives, and countless opportunities to continue growing together as partners and individuals. But perhaps the most beautiful aspect of their current situation was how naturally and sustainably it had all developed. They hadn't forced or manipulated their way into success. They had simply remained true to their values and authentic selves, and opportunities had emerged organically from that foundation of integrity and mutual care. I love our life, Michael said simply, reaching for James's hand while smiling at Ray, who had paused in his knitting to watch them with his characteristic expression of gentle satisfaction. I love our life too, James replied, squeezing Michael's hand and looking around at the home and community they had built together. And I am grateful to be part of this beautiful experiment in love and creativity and partnership, Ray added, returning to his knitting with renewed focus and obvious contentment. As the stars began to appear in the darkening sky above New Orleans, Michael understood that this was what happiness looked like. Not a dramatic climax or a perfect resolution, but a quiet moment of gratitude and connection, surrounded by people who loved and understood you, engaged in work that mattered, with a future full of possibilities stretching ahead. The banner that Ray had created for their shop's opening still hung in their front window, its message as relevant now as it had been that first day. Love is not about being the main character in someone else's story. It's about finding someone who wants to write a new story with you, one beautiful stitch at a time. And as they sat together in the gathering darkness, Michael realized that they were still writing that story, still adding new chapters and unexpected plot developments, still discovering new depths of love and partnership that surprised and delighted them. It was, he thought, exactly the kind of story he had always dreamed of being part of. Not as a supporting character in someone else's narrative, but as a co-author of something beautiful and meaningful and entirely their own.